International Green Key Coordinator, and I will moderate this webinar today. So today we want to talk about the comeback of single-use plastics due to the corona pandemic, as they are basically seen as a means to assure safety and hygiene. But although the safety and the health of the staff and the guests is of course the most important, we think it does not have to come at the cost of the environment, as you will learn today. So let me introduce our speakers for today. We have Joe Hendricks, who is the founder and CEO of Travel Without Plastics. And we have Kelsey Wilson, project lead at Innovation Lighthouse. Welcome both, and thank you for taking the time to joining our webinar today. Just a few housekeeping rules for today. So before we start, please make sure that your microphone is muted and also that your camera is switched off. And if you would like to ask a question for our Q&A session afterwards, please write it in the chat box. And I would like to inform you that this webinar will be recorded. So please be aware of that. And if you're interested to rewatch the webinar, you're welcome to do so tomorrow on the YouTube channel of Green Key International. And now I will leave the floor to Joe.
So thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. It's great to be partnering with Green Key International on the topic of single-use plastics in tourism, and it's really great to see so many of you could join us for the webinar today. As Isabel said, my name's Joe Hendricks. I'm the founder of Travel Without Plastic and Greener Guest. I'll be joined by Kelsey Wilson of Innovation Lighthouse, and she'll give us a quick introduction later on in the presentation. We've got an awful lot to cover today, so we'll move straight in to the items once we've done a very short intro to Travel Without Plastic, just so you know who we are and why we're here. And as Isabel said, we'll be saving some time at the end for questions, so if anything does come up as you're listening, feel free to capture those in the chat or jot them down at the end. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the work of Travel Without Plastic already, our experience of helping hotels to reduce plastic waste goes back to 2011, but we didn't actually make this the sole focus of our work until back in 2017. In 2018, we launched the first version of the Let's Reduce Single-Use Guide and Toolkit, and we update this every year. It's currently being used by hotels all over the world. And we've always helped businesses to navigate this balance between hygiene, safety, sustainability, and the guest experience. And in July this year, we updated our tools to make sure that the health and safety advice was more clearly highlighted. And we summarised those recommendations around plastic and hygiene in a separate chapter so that the points were more easily accessed in one place. We've also undertaken a range of workshops and webinars over the past 3 years, training staff internationally at global levels. But we also work on destination projects as well. And those have ranged from setting up the plastic-free Lao, for instance, in Southeast Asia, working on plastic-free holidays in Mallorca, and green in the Gambia in West Africa. So we do have quite a lot of experience in this, but it's always great to do these types of international webinars, as we can hear from you, we get more questions, we learn from you and from your experiences as well. So one thing we learned already, with many thanks to those of you that took the time to fill in the pre-webinar survey, is that the results were very interesting and certainly showed us a trend, as the vast majority of you highlighted at least one or two of these products as the key challenges to your business at the moment. There were, of course, lots of others, including plastic bags, bin liners, straws and amenities. But by far these three were the most overwhelming challenges that cropped up. In terms of other issues, almost everyone highlighted that it was difficult to find suitable and affordable alternatives, and many of you had issues relevant to staff engagement and of course concerns around any changes that may impact on customer satisfaction. And this of course will get some great insight from Kelsey at Innovation Lighthouse later on in the presentation. firstly, before we look at the potential recommendations to reduce plastic and to meet hygiene standards, I think it's important that we highlight that we need to think logically about preventing the spread of infection. I think it's probably fair to say that when COVID first started, a lot of us were in a kind of panic mode. Whereas now we've had some time to think about it a bit more and to think about our responses and a recovery strategy in a more considered way. And viruses such as COVID-19 and others are generally spread by contact with a contaminated surface or through poor respiratory hygiene from an infected person. So in the hotel environment, the accommodation environment, this is high touch surfaces like door handles, lift buttons and handrails that have now become obvious points of potential transmission. Way back, actually, a few years back in the States, a study found there were actually 40 times more bacteria on lift buttons than on toilet seats. Yet if you think back, we probably paid a lot more attention to cleaning toilets than we did to the zero or the ground floor buttons in the lifts, which most people are likely to press and which can very much harbour germs. Many times in my past as a health and safety auditor, that was a previous role I had some time ago, when we dealt with illness outbreaks in hotels, it was the advice to clean things like lift buttons and to more regularly switch buffet utensils every 10 to 15 minutes that was enough to prevent ongoing transmission. The answer has never really been to revert to having everything in single-use plastic. Not now, not previously. And we certainly can't afford for single-use plastic to always be the default option every time something happens. So it's important that we start to look at processes and not products, because products are also surfaces. They have a surface area and they can become contaminated too. In fact, over 125 scientists have now agreed in a written statement that returning to single-use plastic is not necessary to minimise the spread of infection. Single-use products create more waste and they can actually be sources of pollution and health hazards themselves if they're not properly disposed of. And I think we need to remember, if we can, that whilst COVID-19 might be with us for many more months, even 2 to 3 years, potentially, who knows, the single-use plastic we use today can be with us for centuries. And we need to have smarter solutions. And certainly wrapping single-use plastic in single-use plastic, as we see in this picture, is not a smart solution, but it's certainly a good slide to lead us into that #1 product that respondents were concerned with, and that was plastic water bottles. We'll spend some time on this because it was so concerning to some of you. So how you serve water will essentially come down to who your customers are and where you actually serve the water. What part of the accommodation do you serve the water in? Now, I should be clear here, not all of our suggestions will work for everyone. Every business is different and you may need to take variations on these recommendations. It's also important to highlight that changes do take effort and planning to implement, and to be successful, some of them will need new budgets. Single-use plastic is one of the cheapest products out there, and finding alternatives that match it for price and usability is very tricky. And so one of the first things we all really need to do is be open to a new mindset and a new way of thinking about change and of thinking about operating procedures. Whenever we chat with hoteliers, we always ask them to try and not think that this solution won't work in our hotel, but to think instead what needs to change so that we can implement new ways of working. I think because if COVID has shown us anything, it's that we need to change, and we're certainly capable of change when we put our mind to it. And many of the local regulations that have come about as a result of COVID do actually suggest reusable alternatives, as long as hygiene practices are implemented, and it just requires some effort on your behalf. So looking at water provision in particular, if water is good enough quality to drink from the tap, So what we mean by that is it's not just safe, but it also tastes nice. Where I am in the Canaries, our water is safe, but it tastes terrible. So very few people want to drink it. But if you do have a good quality water, then we would recommend that you firstly encourage the consumption of tap water, because that can eliminate plastic bottles completely. But it's also important to state that water quality should be checked regularly to ensure that safety standards are always being met. Now, if like in the Canaries, the water tastes unpleasant, but it's a good enough quality for filtration, we're seeing many more hotels take this up now to filter and bottle water on site, and then either serve that in reusable glass bottles or buy the glass on request. And filtered water served in this way doesn't necessarily need to be free of charge. If you rely on the income generated from bottled water, you can still charge for this as long as it's filtered water and not just plain tap water. We would generally suggest offering this at a lower price to bottled water. It's more likely then to get the take up from the guests. Where you do provide water free of charge and by self-service, we've noticed now that many of the filter companies are offering touch-free dispensers or pedal-operated dispensers in response to COVID-19. And of course, many of them enable you to pay monthly. So there's not a large upfront investment. And this is worth checking, as they might not necessarily advertise this in a way that it's easy to find that information out. Hotels that we've worked with have actually saved over 50% on their water costs when they've switched to filter systems. So it can make serious financial sense if you look at the return on the investment. It's also important, if you plan for changes and you do have access to a health and safety consultant, to involve them to make sure that you are still meeting hygiene standards, particularly when it comes to cleaning and sanitizing the equipment on the outside, and those buttons, if they are still operated in that way, that could become high touch areas. But it is important to remember, not all health and safety consultants have a sustainability mindset, just as not all sustainability consultants have a health and safety mindset. And we know that for hotels, finding that balance between safety and sustainability is very important, because you have a lot of boxes to tick. On that note, when we look at filter systems, if you choose osmosis filter systems, they can waste a lot of water. If you're going to install them, it's a very good idea to ensure the maintenance team are involved with this and get them to plumb in a system that enables you to efficiently use the wastewater, and whether that's for gardening or for swimming pools that we're seeing a lot more hotels do here. There's obviously not any point in solving one problem to create another. And of course, your Green Key audit looks at many more sustainability issues and not just plastic reduction. Other options for water service also include water in returnable glass bottles. These are great for meal services and restaurants, but obviously not for the use around pools or beaches, where breakages could occur and cause injury. It's also really important to think about the type of bottle. If you do filter and bottle water on site, then bottles with wide and short necks are much better for hygiene, as the water doesn't tend to collect in them when they're drained upside down, and they're much easier to clean as they go through a dishwasher. And many of these designs are also available in non-breakable reusable alternatives, so they can be used around a pool or on the beach. You may decide to provide reusable bottles for guests, and if you do, it's a good idea to think about how you enable guests to have those washed on a daily basis. We've started to see a few places now take up a system that's similar for a towel reuse program, where guests return their bottle at the end of the day like they would a beach towel, and they swap it for a clean one. That reusable bottle then goes through the exact same dishwashing process as cups and knives and forks that everybody is happy to eat and drink with. One of the barriers here may be cost. And you would need to be sure that guests don't take those bottles home, unless of course you want to gift the bottle to the guests. But if you do need to ensure the reusable bottles are returned, then again, you can implement a similar deposit system to a pooled towel system, whereby each time the bottle is returned, it's either replaced with a new one or with a card, so that the next time the customers show the card, they get a clean bottle. You'd need to give some thought as to how this would work in your specific situation. It's not a straightforward process, but it can work, and it is working. And there are very nice ways to communicate this so that it sounds positive and so that any concerns around hygiene are allayed. It's also important when looking at filtered water or bottled water in this way to think that you might need to make changes in the kitchen or the washing areas for additional dishwashing facilities and for safe areas to store glass or reusable bottles. If your business is closed at the moment or operating on minimal capacity, it is a good time to start to think about the work that needs to be done so that you can plan budgets against the return on investment to see how some of these things would work out for you. There's a number of reasons why at Travel Without Plastic we don't automatically recommend gifting reusable bottles freely to customers. Number one, it can be very expensive, especially the thermal bottles that maintain water at a cool temperature, which is what most of us want them to do. Secondly, many guests will actually have their own reusable bottles at home. I now personally turn down reusable bottles if they're gifted to me because I've got so many of them and they're just sitting in a cupboard under the kitchen sink. And the resources that go into making those bottles are wasted if I don't actually use them. And thirdly, we see this quite a lot. There's not a lot of point in providing reusable water bottles if you don't then make refilling them a possibility. If tap water is good enough to drink, then obviously you can suggest this. But if not, perhaps you could make water available for refill at breakfast, so people could fill up in the morning, or you could find out about refill stations in your local area and encourage guests to take their reusable water bottles out with them. You can also offer refills at a charge if you need to cover your costs. But again, we would make this less than the price of a plastic water bottle just to encourage the uptake. We also know a number of hotels now and tour operators who are selling reusable bottles that have got the filter systems in. And these work really, really well in order to filter water on the go, particularly if people are doing itinerary trips or they're going to be out for a long time. If you do need to continue with single use for whatever reason, maybe reusable is not a possibility for you right now, we would very much recommend that you give priority to water bottles that at least already contain recycled content and ensure that you continue to properly separate them for recycling. The PET is actually one of the most commonly processed materials and is most widely accepted. Try to avoid providing refreshments in materials that are not readily accepted or recycled in your destination, and just question any marketing technology. Just because something sounds good doesn't necessarily mean it's better. Just because something is technically recyclable doesn't mean it's actually recyclable in your destination structure. Many products are much more difficult to process, especially when they're comprised of mixed materials. So we would very much advise checking with waste collection companies to find out exactly what they can accept and work to those principles. And to always remember that recycling is a great place to start, but it's a really terrible place to stop. There are other options as well that may be available to you if you do need to continue with plastic bottles. Quite popular in certain areas are eco-brick exchange schemes. Not only do these save plastic bottles from going into the waste stream, but you can also fill them with all types of other clean, non-recyclable plastics. If you operate excursions or if your guests go out, you can encourage them to bring back bottles and plastics for recycling. And this really does demonstrate your commitment to to keeping plastics out of the environment where waste infrastructure is not necessarily so readily available. And once rendered in a situation like this, the bottles won't break down. They do remain sturdy and they shouldn't turn into microplastics. And so we've spent some key time, hopefully giving you some ideas there on water, because it was such a predominant feature in the surveys. And of course, as we said earlier, some of those ideas may or may not work for you, and you may need to take some variations. Another key issue highlighted by almost all of the respondents to the survey was packaging relevant to food service. In some destinations, we know already that self-service buffets are no longer allowed, and food may need to be cooked to order, or perhaps it will be served in a buffet scenario, but it will be served to you by staff. I recently had this experience on a holiday just a couple of weeks ago, and this actually worked really well to have the staff serve from the buffet, from the buffets themselves. In other destinations, buffets can operate if food is pre-portioned, so it does require a new approach to food service. And it's helpful to think about how you can pre-portion foods that can be served in reusable dishes. And this might have to mean cutting back slightly on the number of choices on the menu to make this a realistic option. Guests might initially find this quite strange, but within a couple of days, they usually adjust very easily to this. We watched this ourselves during our holiday a couple of weeks ago. This type of change does require an initial investment, and we spoke with the executive chef at the hotel, who said the return on investment for the glass dishes that you can see in these photographs will actually be less than 12 months for that hotel. So financially, these reusable dishes that they're filling with jams and honey, nuts and seeds and salad portions, milk, etc., they actually make more financial sense in the medium term than constantly continually buying single-use plastics. Interestingly, they also found it to be less time-consuming for staff in terms of preparation than they thought it would be. And this is one of the key issues when it comes to change, that we need to remove the preconceptions and we need to try things first, rather than just assuming they won't work without giving things a chance. And the added bonus from precautions like this is also a reduction in food waste, which can significantly reduce costs. So you can tick a number of sustainability boxes by taking these steps. We also found that labelling the buffet was really important. Otherwise, everybody just picks all of these things up to look at what's in them, which means you might as well have just kept the regular buffet with the tongs and a good sneeze screen. But labelling is therefore really important, so that people know what's contained within the foods. In a lot of the current COVID regulations, refillable condiments are actually acceptable, provided that you have a procedure that they're sanitised between guests using them. Now, this might mean that you need to have a lot of stock to ensure that condiments can be removed and replaced after each use. Or you may decide that you can provide condiments in ramekins if you offer a plate service, for instance, or they could also be pre-portioned and set on buffets. If this is a bit difficult at the moment for you, or if it's not an option and you need to continue with single-use sachets, then it can be a good idea to make these available on request. Just because they're single-use doesn't make them any more hygienic than a sanitised refillable bottle. In fact, whilst we were on holiday, we watched how people interacted with sachets, and it's really interesting to do this. They don't just touch one sachet, they generally tend to touch them all. And this is because they want to rummage around to get to what they want, or because they're so difficult to open that you end up putting it back, picking up another one to try again until you actually manage to open one. And if you watch the staff after the guests leave the table, they tend to remove the box, don't usually clean it, but if they do, they certainly don't clean every single sachet before putting it back. So people are still touching those sachets. There's still a contact surface, and making them available on request helps to keep that down. We also saw a colleague of ours found a great way of serving jams in these refillable jars that you can see at the bottom of the screen there. So that enables you to still provide these in a bulk format, but to maintain some very good hygiene standards with those. And this is also something that came up in the response to surveys, and that's plastic film. This is another photo from my recent holiday, and when we asked why the bananas and the oranges that have their own skin are wrapped in film, we were told that it was because people have a tendency to pick them up and to feel them to see if they're ripe. So they've been wrapped to avoid contamination from people's fingers. But again, if you watch the buffet, you still see that everybody still picks them up and they still feel them to see if they're ripe. The film does nothing to stop this. It doesn't stop contamination from fingers, it just creates waste. It's more understandable why you would maybe wrap apples and pears, as they could be eaten without the skin being removed. But it's also worth monitoring how popular these fruits are and considering whether or not in the times we're in you need to provide them at all. Wrapping fruit like this in plastic generally makes it sweat and it can spoil much more quickly and become food waste. We also saw some very elaborate ways of serving biscuits and sweets, as you can see on the left. And again, in order to see what was in them, everybody picked them up. So we really weren't reducing those contact points at all. It was a similar scenario with tea and coffee in the room. The top picture shows how it was set when we walked into the room. The bottom picture shows what was in the paper bag. So the tea bags and the condiments were in the paper bag, but not the cups and spoons. So maybe germs don't stick to cups and spoons. Another way to do this would be to make tea and coffee facilities available on request, or to provide some form of accompanying milk and sugar in refillable jugs that do need to be changed daily and can guarantee hygiene. And it actually turns out to be a similar amount of effort as it is to put everything into the paper bag. Whilst a lot of our recommendations focus on reusable and refillable alternatives, this can be very tricky when it comes to food to go, unless your hotel is quite high end. And the picture in the bottom right there is actually from a safari camp in Kenya, and this is how the picnic is provided. The staff who lead the safari take care of making sure everything comes back to go through the dishwasher. The paper waste is discarded with compostable waste, and the bottles are glass and they're returned to the supplier. Now, for many hotels, this is not going to be possible, either because it's just too expensive, or guests may be on multi-trip itineraries. They may not actually be returning to your hotel at the end of the day. Increasingly, there are cardboard picnic packaging options, as you can see here, and I'm sure in the coming months there's going to be a lot more innovation in this area. We're seeing new things every day. Greaseproof paper is also another good way to wrap sandwiches and wraps. Again, that's much better than cling film, as food in the film tends to sweat and it becomes unpleasant to eat. But it is really important, if you use cardboard or paper packaging, to check with the supplier that it's not lined with plastic, which is the case with coffee cups, as they're practically impossible to recycle, and you almost can't see the plastic, which makes you think that the whole thing is made from paper. We found that bagasse is quite a good material if you need to insulate hot food on the go. That tends to break down in around about 6 weeks or so. And you can also think wisely about what goes into the picnic, and remember to keep the waste lens in your focus. You could as well prioritise working with excursion operators, or influence excursion operators and tour operators to include breakfast and lunch stops in their itineraries so that the picnic can be avoided altogether. In the worst case scenario, if you do have to stick with single-use plastic for food to go, then do your very best to encourage people to dispose of it responsibly, either through branding on the packaging or messaging at the point of sale, or when guests pick it up. So what we really want to do is to avoid the plastic from becoming environmental pollution. So if you do need to continue using it, let's take all of the possible steps to prevent it from becoming plastic pollution. Moving on, because we don't have a great deal of time and we do have a lot to cover, I'd just like to take a very quick look at how we can minimise the amount of waste created from cleaning and from sanitising. and from other activities around sanitation. One thing that we have spotted is it can be tempting to replace single-use amenities in hotel rooms with COVID kits, but this is something we would recommend against where possible. If you can provide sufficient hand sanitising stations throughout your premises, then you can help to avoid the need for guests to carry miniature plastic bottles with them. By all means, if you feel it necessary, you can make masks and sanitisers available for sale, but it is again important to ask people to dispose of them responsibly when they're finished with. It's also really important to know the vast majority of single-use cleaning wipes are not flushable, even if they say they are flushable on the packet. And to remember that in order to kill germs, cleaning solutions need to stay wet on a surface for anything up to 1 full minute, and this is highly unlikely to be achieved with a cleaning wipe. And in the worst case scenario, they can be used improperly and they can actually spread germs around rather than cleaning them up. So it's a good idea where you can to stick to reusable cloths, and preferably made from natural materials and not microfibers, which would shed in the wash, and to have good processes in place to ensure that sanitising solution is left for the right amount of time to actually work and to change cloths regularly. Now, of course, because of these new protocols, there's also bound to be an increase in chemical use at the moment, and this is also not good for the environment, nor is it good for our health. In terms of plastic reduction, it's great to look for suppliers who take back their packaging so that it can be reused. The types of plastic containers that cleaning products come in are very robust, and they're designed to be reused many times over, not just once. We would very much advise that you seek advice on cleaning processes and that you don't overuse chemicals if you don't need to. Sometimes just plain old soap and water will do the trick. And you can also look out for new innovations like stabilised aqueous ozone, for instance, where you just constantly refill your own cleaning bottles with a water-based solution. There are no toxic chemical use in these types of innovations, and they also don't require the use of PPE. So there are some great new things out there. As we said earlier, it's really important that we do whatever we can to make sure any single-use plastic that we have to use or that we're finding ourselves using at the moment is disposed of so that it doesn't become litter. Even plastic waste that is disposed of in a bin can blow out very easily if the bin doesn't have a lid, and masks like these can take up to 450 years to decompose. All of this said, we know that you need to follow local regulations around the correct disposal of any other contaminated waste. Aside from staff engagement and communications that we'll come on to shortly, we also found that many respondents mentioned that finding truly sustainable alternatives was a key issue. This is something we hear regularly. So I'll share our insight and hopefully give you again some information that will just help you to make more considered purchasing decisions. Now this slide is blank for a reason, and that's because the best alternative can sometimes actually be no alternative at all. You know, do you really have to replace everything, or are there some things that you could do without, or some things that could be replaced with a service? So for instance, replacing sewing kits with a mending service, replacing minibar items with a room service, or maybe removing some of the cheaper items like slippers, razors and shoe shines, and offering full-size, good quality alternatives, but for sale and not necessarily for free. Now, there is a concern amongst hoteliers when we suggest this, as they believe that taking something away can impact on the guest service. But actually, we found a project collaborator of ours in Mallorca actually took some time to ask the guests if they thought that removing some of these amenities would create a negative response, a negative impact to the customer experience. And actually, the answer was no, it wouldn't. Despite the hotel manager thinking that it would generate complaints, but not really knowing if that would be the case because they hadn't tried it. And in recent times, many guests are changing their expectations, but our habits in hospitality are not necessarily keeping up. But if you think about it logically, do you really need to provide a shoe shine in a hotel where everybody wears flip-flops? We really need to think about prioritising waste reduction more than product replacement. If we are, for instance, just to replace 500,000 plastic straws with 500,000 paper straws, we're really just shifting the problem. Reusable alternatives are great. We've talked about them a lot, but they need to be reused. So it's estimated you need to reuse a cotton bag anywhere between 150 to 300 times before it has the same environmental footprint as a plastic bag. And this is because of the considerable resources that go into creating the product. So if they're only going to be used a few times and sit in the kitchen drawer, there's really no environmental gain. It might look good, but it's ultimately shifting the environmental burden elsewhere. It's similar with paper. A paper bag needs to be used around 4 to 8 times. And how likely would this be to happen in practice? And this is also an interesting one. We often hear that replacing single-use cups and glasses for reusable ones is expensive. Guests take them home, especially if they're branded and they look nice. So the overall cost to the hotel can increase significantly. It might seem a bit controversial, but why not consider paying for branded items with the marketing budget rather than from the food and beverage budgets or from the housekeeping budget, for instance? If any of you have been to World Travel Market, how many items do you see there all paid for marketing budgets, which could be put to much better use? And it's also really important to check that the environmental alternatives that you're looking for are actually doing the job that they say they do. Not all of them are as green as they seem. It really is worth taking the time to make the right decision for your business, to look at the marketing terminology and to be absolutely clear by checking this with the suppliers and asking them about how to responsibly dispose of their products. Some of the most highly efficient waste management systems in the world can't deal with multi-material products, so it's worth, again, being really clear on what can be accepted in the waste management systems that are available to you in your destination. And obviously, and I know that I'm rushing to complete a lot and to get a lot through here, we've pulled all of this together into an online e-learning with our sister site Greener Guest, which we will share with you, or Isabel will share with you at the end of the e-learning, so you can complete some interactive training and do this in your own time. Very quickly, to move on to staff engagement, just the last couple of slides before I hand on to Kelsey. We suggest that it's really important to spend time together as a team and to truly redefine together what the word necessary means, because we often find that it's brand standards that are stopping people from being able to make changes. If you have autonomy over your standards, this can be easier to change, but if you're hotels that are part of a large chain or that have centralised procurement, this needs to come as leadership from head office, otherwise local managers can't make that change. It's worth considering temporary and permanent legislation when you redefine what necessary is. And even if you don't have legislation in your destination, think about the legislation in the country of origin. If you rely on guests from Northern European countries, for example, that are more environmentally friendly and are used to not seeing so much single-use plastic, they might be very disappointed to come across it in your hotel. And finally, breaking habits. It's really hard, but it's crucial if we're going to change. And if staff have been with you for many, many years, it can be difficult. But it is worth persevering and taking the time, work together with staff, find people that are ambassadors that will lead the way and motivate others to change. And don't give up at the first hurdle. Expect challenges and deal with them and monitor those outcomes. And not everything will work, but it's definitely worth trying variations. And it's a similar process for guests. Your guests may find it difficult to adapt to your changes, but don't give up after 1 or 2 complaints. Engage with them and explain the why. And this is a really great time to hand over to Kelsey from Innovation Lighthouse, so she can tell us about some of the things that the hotels they work with are doing and how communications are helping to reassure guests in times of COVID recovery, and what's working well for others might also work well for you.
Thanks, Jo. Thanks for the introduction. I'll just share my screen so that we can get started.
Yes, thank you very much, Jo. I would just like to repeat for all our participants that we will send the link to your online learning program after the webinar. So if you want to go deeper into everything that you've heard just now, please, I really recommend to take the course. And now over to you, Kelsey.
Nice, thanks, Isabel. So for those of you that don't know about our company yet, Innovation Lighthouse, I'll just give a quick introduction and then we'll jump right in. So at Innovation Lighthouse, people ask us questions like, okay, I want to take action with our sustainability targets, but not sure what will exactly work best to meet those targets, or how can I get behind the door of the buildings that my guests and or tenants behave more sustainably to save water and energy. So we take the guesswork out of these questions by testing and measuring sustainability interventions so that building operators, CSR managers can implement solutions that work for them. And today, we're going to talk about 4 tips for sustainable and social hotel operation in current times. So hopefully adding on to what Jo has just talked about from a communication standpoint and also from a behavioral standpoint. So these insights are from our Sustainable Reopening Project. And we worked with 4 hotels. So we worked with QO, the Student Hotel, Stay OK, and Meininger. We started out at the beginning of the project thinking we would help mostly giving advice for technical innovations to help manage crowding and reducing single-use plastics, so offering alternatives. But in our baseline surveys in June, we found out from the data that it was mostly about communication to guests and really managing their expectations. So once we knew what guests wanted, we were able to see what areas there were for improvement, and those were mostly around communication. So as I said, our project was really based on getting data-driven insights from guests so that we could understand what guests want in a rapidly changing and challenging period so that the hotels could adjust accordingly. So before we get into the results, let's look at how we set up the project and why. So we worked with 4 hotels, again, 3 in Amsterdam, so Meininger, TSH, and QO, and then 1 in Utrecht called Stay OK. We worked across 4 months from June to September, just recently closed the project, and we did about 20 site visits, so several to the 4 participating hotels, and then a lot of hotels throughout Amsterdam to just get best practice, you know, like Jo's talking about on our holiday, just get inspired, what's everyone else doing, how can we use those insights to make the project a bit more interesting. And then we did around 200 surveys with guests in the 4 hotels. So we did a first period in June, and then we implemented solutions, and then a final period in September. So just before we jump into the results, I want to give an overview of our way of work. So on the left-hand side, we started with some site visits, kick off with the hotels. And then we said, okay, we really need to understand better the challenges from the guests. What are guests saying? What are their kind of pain points? How are we going to make them feel more comfortable? So we did a first round of surveys with guests, and then we chose solutions, so more social and more sustainable solutions or processes based on what guests were saying. And then fourth, we did an implementation plan. So this was really brainstorming with all of the hotels from a process standpoint. How can we better implement these solutions? Because a lot of times, as Jo's saying as well, it comes down to a process. So thinking along with these hotels, what's the best way we can do that? And then on the right-hand side, you have this big circle, which is a test period, and where we introduced and kind of tweaked the solutions and did a second round of surveys in September to see how well those solutions did to make guests feel more comfortable, that kind of thing. All right, so we work in behavioral research as well with some of our colleagues from Wageningen University in the north of the Netherlands. And for some of our projects, a great, quick and easy reminder is the following. So when you want to change behavior, a good acronym to remember is Go East. So super easy to remember. And when you want to change behavior, think about making your intervention first easy. So reduce the hassle for your guests or your staff. Simplify your messages. Make it really easy and really clear and simplistic for everyone to understand. Make it attractive and rewarding. So Thinking about what someone gets for complying with the behavior is really important. So when you make it easy and attractive for them, it's often hard to say no when it comes to getting the desired behavior. Think about that. Third, social. So show that most people perform the desired behavior. For instance, if your staff and guests are behaving in the desired way, it's likely that a new guest coming into that space will also behave in that way. So make it the norm. Lead by example. Have your staff really on board and lead that way. Next, timely. So consider immediate costs and benefits. So humans in general are quite good at taking action that's right away. So if you want to nudge behavior, it's best to do it right at the moment that they could change that behavior rather than somewhere else. So I'll get into some examples later. So here's some results. So from June to September, guest comfort levels at the 4 hotels stayed almost at the same high level. So June to September, pretty much the same, about 4.25 out of 5 on average. And then guest expectations stayed pretty much the same as well. Good cleaning and proper communication were the 2 key things that guests wanted. And when it comes to good cleaning, as Joe mentioned as well, it's really about visibility. So guests really wanted to see that things were being cleaned in front of them. And then we asked, okay, which elements make guests feel more comfortable during their stay? So these came down to 3 things in June and September in those 2 test periods. The first and most important was visual information. So 70 to 75% of guests mark this as being most important. So these are things like flyers, videos, any kind of content before their stay, for instance. And then next is staff behavior. So we found this is a really important one as well, that staff leading by example, also offering verbal cues to tell policies. And then finally, 1.5 meter messaging. When it came to elements that made guests feel uncomfortable during their stay, these ones changed a lot from the first test period in June to the last test period in September. So at first, it was really about lack of cleanliness. So guests were complaining that things were not clean, it was not being visible. And then in September, it changed to too many people in lobby and common areas. So this also comes down, this is a good example to talk about the EAST acronym. So making communication easy, attractive, social, and timely can help your guests better understand expectations of them, leading by example, make it easy for them, also make it social so that they know that the norm in this space is to follow the rules. And then as well, throughout the whole project, unclear distancing messages. So similar as the one above. So these are the 2 main challenges that hotels are still struggling with. All right, so now I'm going to get into the 4 tips we give based on guest feedback and findings from the project. So I'll introduce the advice and then back it up with a case study from one or multiple of the hotels from the project and show how we can all learn from that. So some of these are indeed quite common sense, and a lot of hotels are probably already using these practices, but hopefully these give like really concrete, practical examples, inspiration or ideas of how you can use them as well. So let's jump in. First one is verbal communication can't be substituted by visual communication and the other way around. So we took this into practice with the Student Hotel Amsterdam City and Stay OK in Utrecht. So at the Student Hotel, there are 2 main ways of communicating with guests about their measures. Were first an email before check-in, and second a video in the lobby. And the first survey, guests said they wanted more verbal information from the staff. They wanted more. They wanted that kind of like verbal, really human connection and reassurance. So we said, okay, what can we do? Let's do a standard 30-second script with 4 things, 4 like of the key measures that they're taking at the Student Hotel. And then as well for Stay OK, 90% of guests mark staff behavior as making them feel more comfortable and reassured. So they were already doing a really good job at that, and they quite pride themselves on this as well. And after at the Student Hotel, the number of guests indicating staff information and behavior as positive increased by 10%. So this was just after a couple of weeks of introducing something really small, a 30-second script at check-in. Next one, visual communication about policies should not only be in common areas, but also in guest rooms. So this is something we really found out from the surveys, and we took it into practice with Meininger. So On the first survey, guests stated they would be more comfortable having more information about policies, particularly in the rooms, because up to that point, most of the information had just been, by the elevators, at the lobby, at the restaurant. So their hotel manager decided to put flyers with information about the measures in all the rooms. So this is also a good example of the Go East acronym, that you want to put something in a timely place. So often when a guest is in their room, that's when they might be thinking about cleaning. So, okay, has this been cleaned? What's the policy about cleaning in the rooms? If you put something right where they're thinking about that, it's likely that they feel more reassured and that their behavior is therefore moderated. So after this, we saw like really good results with this one actually. On the second round of surveys, 100% of the guests were comfortable with the amount of visual information. So this was up from 50%. So it's a really big increase. Next one, this goes along the lines with Joe's presentation as well, and we saw this in practice, that instead of offering single-use plastics by default, ask guests if they want it. So there's a lot of ways to change your process. This is one that we took into practice with the student hotel. So they were offering one of these COVID kits, a goodie bag, that contained hand sanitizer, gloves, a jump rope, some kind of small gifts. And we thought, okay, this is a really good opportunity to see, do guests want this? Do they value this? Does it make them feel more comfortable? On the first survey, as we expected, guests didn't mind too much about the goodie bag, and they could mostly skip the items. So what they liked the most was the small hand sanitizer, but they put more hand sanitizers around the lobby, so that fixed that. And they saw that, okay, after a process review, analyzing the guest preferences, we will just ask the guests if they want this goodie bag, rather than giving it to every guest by default. And then they just didn't order any more goodie bags once the stock ran out. Okay, fourth and final point, thinking creatively about processes helped all 4 hotels reduce extra waste. So in the Netherlands, hotels are actually allowed to have full breakfast buffets with guests serving themselves. So Meininger and Stay OK chose to reopen their buffets in a responsible way, which avoided a lot of waste from prepackaged takeaway breakfast, and guest responses were really positive. Next is refillable amenities. So QO decided to keep its refillable amenities in the rooms and focused on increased informing of guests. So they kept telling guests, about their process and involving them in their sustainability procedure. Next was just the one I talked about with the student hotel, really thinking about, is this necessary? Do we need to offer this by default, or do we need to have a replacement? And then in this case, it was no. All right, so that brings us back to the beginning. When designing interventions for your staff, guests, etc., whether it's communicating to them about more sustainable procedures or making them feel reassured, remember this little acronym to change behavior. So if you can walk away remembering one thing from my presentation, it's to make behavioral changes easy, attractive, social, and timely. So that's it for me today. If you want to get in touch with me, we have a lot more survey results, a lot more insights from the project, so I'm super happy to share them. Feel free to get in touch with me at kelsey@innovationlighthouse.org. Thanks, everyone, and I will open it up to Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, Kelsey, and also thank you again, Joe, for your presentation. And thank you, Kelsey, for opening the Q&A session. We had some questions in the chat that I would like to address, but maybe there are other questions that you would like, so please write them in the chat now and we will follow up. And I will just start with some questions that gathered in the chat. So Joe, one question during your presentation was, what about the plastic water bottles that get recycled? You already addressed it a little bit, but maybe you can say a few more words. What are the advantages and disadvantages of bottles that are being sent to recycling?
I think it's the one thing with plastic bottles when they go for recycling is they generally don't become another plastic bottle, because the type of plastic that used to make them is not the best. So they end up being downcycled is probably a better way of of saying what happens to them once they go into that process. But at least they're not going into landfill, they're not going into, they're not becoming pollution. So it's still definitely the better thing to recycle them and separate them. One of the things around recycled content, that comes from a more circular economy perspective. So when things are being made from recycled content, there's more incentive to recycle, there's more incentive to avoid fossil fuels at the origin. So it's really trying to follow circular economy principles in doing that. But it's important to remember, again, recycled content and recyclable, and to be aware of those different terminologies that people are using to market them, to make sure you do get the type of plastic that you want, and that you can continue to recycle that and keep that circular loop.
Okay, thank you very much. And then there was another question from the UK, or from someone in the UK, asking about compostable single-use products. So the question was if the recycling infrastructure is ready for these kind of products, and maybe you can just say a few words about compostable single-use products.
I think if the recycling infrastructure is available, that also needs to mean the collection is available from the premises, and that the staff and the customers know how to separate them. There are lots of issues with compostables, and there's no time to go into all of that here, but I think it's going to have to be an all or nothing, because they're so similar in the way that they look to other plastics that they very often get mixed up, and people want to recycle. They do their best to separate out, but they don't do it correctly because it's so difficult to do. So I think if you are going to go down the compostable route, or if you've got services from organisations like TerraCycle, for instance, that can pick up really difficult to manage plastics in the UK, you need to make sure that that is incorporated in your own procedures, and your staff and guests can equally follow that. Otherwise, what the recyclers get to deal with is going to be mixed, and it's going to end up going to landfill or to incineration. So it's really important to take the time to consider if they'll work for you properly.
Thank you very much. And there was a similar question about edible cups and plates and spoons that you can see now in some restaurants or takeaways. So how safe are they? And yeah, what's the advantage of this compared to maybe other compostable materials?
I think it depends on how they're handled. So that's something that would really need to be given some definitive thought. And I think pre-COVID, they were probably a bit more popular than what they are now. I think in a COVID world, it's going to be a lot more difficult to include edible types of cutlery, possible in takeaways, you know, pizza boxes, those sorts of things for use or for excursions. But again, in order to guarantee hygiene, I imagine they're going to have to come wrapped in something, and that's likely to be plastic at the moment, or it could be a paper bag. I think you'd need to think very, very carefully and really check back with the suppliers about the hygiene, but also look at your own standards, who's going to be touching those and how are they going to be served to the guests, and what guarantees can you give to the guests. I think that is a bit difficult at the moment.
Yeah, so maybe you could repeat again from your point of view, what would be the best single-use alternative to plastics if you need a single-use alternative and if you cannot use reusable items?
If you still need a single-use alternative, the best alternatives are the ones that can be accepted in your destination by the waste management infrastructure, whether that's formal or informal, depending how waste management works. So we can't, for instance, say it's best to go and get an aluminium can if you don't have the means to recycle aluminium cans, because the energy that goes into making those is extremely intensive, and it's very important to make sure they're recycled if that's your choice. So you need to look at the different trade-offs, I think, in terms of the environmental impacts of those alternatives. But the most important thing is what can be accepted in your destination, and to try to keep items in a single material where possible. So a huge mix of materials are usually much more difficult to recycle than one specific type of plastic. So check with your waste management.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And maybe one final question to Kelsey. And there was one question in relation to flyers or digital information. So what would be a better solution, or yeah, is there one that is better than the other? Have you had any insights on that?
We didn't get insights on that. I think it's, if you would use this acronym again, it's just about placement and visualization of it. So is it easy to understand? Focus on these things rather than maybe the mode. Focus on your messages. Is it simple to understand? Is it visually appealing? Is it, you know, in a lot of locations throughout your space, of course, including the rooms as well? And are you creating an atmosphere in the space where this is the norm to have these desired behaviors or the measures that you're introducing to be followed? Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. The time is actually up. So to both of you, again, thank you very much for taking the time today and for your great presentations. We got a lot of positive feedback from all around the world. I could see that in the chat. So thank you very much. As I said, the recording will be available on the YouTube channel after this webinar. And I will also send the link to the online training session that Joe talked about. And I will also include the email addresses of Joe and Kelsey in the email after the training so that you can contact them if you have any more questions or if you're interested in the services of Joe and Kelsey. So thank you once again to everyone who participated today. And of course, take care and stay safe.
Thanks, Isabel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.